Hey everyone, Christ is risen, and a blessed week of the Holy Myrrh-bearing women. This reflection I've entitled, The Much Suffering Prophet Job and the Darn Coronavirus. Today, May the 6th, happens to be the feast in the Orthodox Church of the holy and much suffering prophet Job. We are familiar with the prophecy of Job because we in fact read his prophecy in church. During the days of Great and Holy Lent, we read through the Proverbs, these magnificent maxims of righteousness and counsel. When we're done with Proverbs, we open the book of Job and begin to read from Job. And Job and Proverbs have a long history together. Job also helps us to anticipate Pascha because Job, according to St. Ephraim of Syria, in the 19th chapter, makes such an incredible clear prophecy about the coming of Christ. He says that he knows that his Redeemer lives. That is a poignant word right in the middle of 42 chapters of pain and suffering. Right in the middle of chapter 19, I know that my Redeemer lives. To be able to confess that in the middle of horrible suffering is key to survival, to spiritual survival. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will take his stand upon the earth. And I from my flesh will see him. This marvelous prophecy about the coming of the Christ and about his own resurrection is a delight to the church. The prophecy of Job, and it has a relationship with Proverbs, not just in being wisdom literature, but in being an offset to Proverbs. Proverbs is full of general maxims and truths, so dear to us. Both books, both the Proverbs and the Prophecy of Job, start in the same way. The Proverbs begins with that magnificent first psalm in which we see the Christ unveiled. Blessed is the man who does not walk down the path of sinners, or stand in the counsel of the ungodly, or sit with scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And he's like a tree planted by the streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers. But the wicked are not so, and on. Those magnificent verses lay out for us the blessing upon the righteous man and what he's like. He's a person with deep roots who is constantly bearing marvelous fruit. Now, the prophecy of Job begins in exactly the same way. In chapter 1, Job, behold the man. He is the righteous man. He is a blameless man. And then after a few verses, as the evil one approaches God in order to tempt Job, God says to him, have you considered my servant Job, a blameless and upright man? It's the same way. It's the same presentation. So both the Proverbs and the prophecy of Job, they begin in the same way. But Proverbs sets forth for us those maxims to be depended on. But Job helps us to recognize that we ought not push those maxims too far. Certainly, the righteous man is the one who's going to prosper, and he's going to be blessed. But be careful. Be careful on how far you push that and how you interpret that. Because Job is the proof that this is not a 100% certainty as we think of blessings. Job was an upright man, exactly as Proverbs 1 was describing, but he went for unusual circumstances, for a unique purpose. He went through horrific sufferings, unthinkable measure of trouble, all, of course, to his salvation and to his glory. None of us would even know that Job existed if he didn't have the sufferings and the trials that he had from God. So Job helps to function as an offset, to help us to read Proverbs with care and with some reserve, making sure that we don't come to false conclusions or think that we can evaluate circumstances, especially in the lives of other people, based upon some strict understanding of 100% certainty in how we read the Proverbs. Job is an offset of that. Job also begins with a magnificent account of the mystery of intercessory prayer. Here Job and his family is revealed. He has these wonderful 10 children who love each other. They love each other so much that they're constantly in each other's houses, nourishing their friendship, celebrating blessings. It's just this picture of the ideal family. And yet, what is Job doing? It says that Job daily offered sacrifices for his children in case they had somehow secretly sinned against God. What kind of father is this man that he would take such forethought and such prayerful concern for his children's spiritual lives, their own relationship to God, that he would take upon himself? Doesn't say he said anything to them or did anything with them. He took the burden upon himself and made sacrifice and took refuge in intercessory prayer for his children, even when he didn't know that they had done anything. Can you imagine? St. John Chrysostom says in his commentary on this chapter, he says, can you imagine how Job would have responded as a father if he knew about a sin or some terrible infraction in his children's lives, some ungodliness? What would he have spared himself in beseeching God for their aid and for their help? So the book begins in this marvelous account of intercessory prayer and this marvelous picture of Job's children. It makes me think often, Kuria Catherine, my beloved, has raised all of our own children by teaching them to practice kindness and love towards each other. And many, many times I've heard her say to her children, to our children, she would say, now, you love each other and be kind because you are each other's best friends, over and over again. Of course, that's itself something of a proverbial maxim. Not every brother and sister actually cultivates best friends. Sadly, we all know too many siblings who have no time for each other at all. But what she's teaching them is that it's time to accept the brothers and sisters that God and his providence have given you to develop friendship with. Invest in the friendship. Assume and work hard at being each other's best friends, and you'll cultivate through your familial relationships an appreciation for the sublime gift of friendship, and you'll learn how to be a friend and how to live with friends and to make them and keep them and how to preserve them. We see this beautiful witness in the life of Job's family. So there's a lot in the prophecy of Job to teach us about prayer and family life. And there's, of course, even more to teach us in Job's prophecy about suffering. You know that the book begins with the catastrophic losses of Job's children. All of their lives are taken, of his fortune, his assets, his livestock, even his health. It's all removed bit by bit, piece by piece, progressively, until he is left with nothing. And he confesses so beautifully, naked I have come into this world, and naked I shall return. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he prostrates himself before God, not understanding, but guarding his mind, guarding his mouth, protecting his heart from presumption and from making conclusions. I'm sure, as we see, his friends come to him and bring to him proverbial maxim after proverbial maxim, all of which fail to account for real life circumstances in Job's life. I'm sure Job was constantly asking himself, why, how? But he guarded himself. His wife, who had a small soul, she was unable to endure her suffering and unable to endure the much greater suffering that her husband had. And so she told him, curse God and die. And he considered her a foolish woman, not to be followed and not to be listened to. Job provides for us, brothers and sisters, an incredible example of guarding a spirit of gratitude before God, regardless of exterior circumstances, and taking refuge in the language of faith in times of inexplainable suffering. And that language, St. John Chrysostom says, is the language of silence. We don't trust God just when we understand everything, when it all makes sense. We trust God because he's trustworthy, and we put our confidence in him. And when we don't understand, we take refuge in silence and worship. This is the example and the encouragement that Job provides for us in the face of suffering. I'd also like to say something to you about human righteousness. You know, the book comes to a crescendo and climaxes in chapter 42, where the Lord appears to Job, and his confidence that he would see from his flesh, his Redeemer, appears in fulfillment, not just after the resurrection, his own resurrection in the future, but even in his own life. He was able to see God, and being close to God as God drew near to him, and as Job drew near to God, the intimacy of being in God's presence brought everything to resolution in Job's life. He says, "Before I heard about you with my ear, now I see you face to face. Therefore I cover my mouth. Speech is irrelevant, and I bow low and repent in dust and ashes." This is the confession of the most righteous man on the earth, of his whole generation, a blameless man, an upright man who, on top of all of his righteousness, endured faithfully suffering that none of us can dream of, as a type of a suffering that only Christ could bear. And yet, what was his summation, his perception of all of his righteousness? Nothing. I am an unrighteous man. I cannot speak in your presence, and I repent in dust and ashes. This is perhaps the most glorious commentary in all of the scriptures upon the value ultimately of human righteousness before God. We don't stand before the presence of God. We don't maintain an intimate union with God because we're something, because we have done something that others haven't, because we are righteous. No. We are near to God, and we draw near to him because he loves us. He has drawn near to us. His will has been to be with us. And his grace, his condescending grace, is our confidence and the reason that we can be near him. On this day, in the middle of these horrible days now, 8 weeks of this lockdown and misery, of this alienation, of this sense of being imprisoned, often in our own homes, seeing so much sorrow all around us. This is a beautiful day, brothers and sisters, to reflect upon the much suffering prophet Job, and to remember as we're facing this horrible virus, and also all of the uncertainty, all of the questions that we're raising, all of the sense of enduring things that are so confusing and yet so painful because of the drastic actions that we've taken, of which effectiveness we don't really know and perhaps never will know. This is a moment perhaps when the witness of the prophet Job is especially important to us. We can practice his language of confident silence and trust in the providence of God. We can endure suffering without despair, guarding always a spirit of gratitude, even when we can't see the end from the beginning, even though we can't understand the road and we can't trace it. We can still be confident and especially guard our mouths and our hearts in silence. We can take refuge in humility and also be certain that our Redeemer lives. So much in the prophecy of Job for us. I hope that you have enjoyed these reflections. If you're interested in more reflection, Patristic Nectar Publications has on our site, in our library, a 5-lecture series on Job, on his life and his suffering, Lessons in Faith and Affliction. Job, Lessons in Faith and Affliction, and you can find it at PNP. God be with you all. Christ is risen. Thank you for watching this video. Please pray for us and subscribe below, and share this video with your friends and family. Our PNP ministry has more projects than we have resources. Would you consider making a tax-deductible contribution to us today? Thank you, and God's help.